Good morning. I'll call to order the regularly scheduled meeting of the Zoning and Planning Committee. Today is January 7th, 2016. I'm Lisa Bender. I chair the committee, and I'm joined by council members Reich, Goodman, Andrew Johnson. We are a quorum of the committee, and we also have Councilmember Fry here as well. We have 7 items on the published agenda. We have an 8th item to add in order to stay in keeping with our 120-day or 60-day law. So I'll go through the agenda and then I'll move to add item number 8. Item number 1 is a public hearing for a fence height variance. Item number 2 is a variance and site plan review for Wells Fargo building. And item number 3 is a certificate of appropriateness appeal from Schaefer Richardson at 112 East Hennepin Avenue. We'll return to those after the consent items. Item number 4 is a zoning board of adjustment reappointment, setting the public hearing for 3 returning members of our zoning board of adjustment, whose service we are very thankful for. Item number 5 is rezoning for Alexander Roberts at 528 University Avenue Southeast, to rezone the property from R5 to C1 to establish a hotel. And I'm sorry, we have the items 6 and 7 are under discussion, so we'll return to those. Those are landmark designations for 404 and 410 West Broadway. Those will come at the end, so I'll then amend the agenda, move to amend the agenda to add item number 8, which is a rezoning at 2929 University Avenue Southeast. This is in Prospect Park. And I think everyone has that information. So I'll move to amend the agenda. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And then I'll move items 4, 5, and 8 for consent. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And that carries. All right, so now we'll return to the public hearing, starting with item number 1 and a staff report on that.
Morning, Chair, committee members. This application is an appeal of a decision made by the Board of Adjustment. The Board of Adjustment granted a variance to develop on a steep slope in the Shoreland Overlay District for a fence. And as part of that same application, the applicant also sought to increase the fence height in the front yard from 3 feet to 6 feet. The applicant has appealed that decision that the board denied their fence height increase. The zoning map shows the subject parcel, 2012 Cedar Lake Parkway, just west of Cedar Lake. And there is a steep slope that drops down to the lake and parkway, as demonstrated on this photo. The applicant has proposed a fence that runs along the south side of the property in the established front yard, approximately 25, or the fence itself is approximately 25 feet long. 20 feet of that is in the established front yard setback. With granting a variance, 6 findings are required. 3 is a part of the standard variance, and 3 being that it's in the Shoreland Overlay District. The first finding is that the parcel is unique in that there is no direct access from Cedar Lake Parkway to the site, but that does not limit doesn't really pertain to the fence height increase as requested. So there's no true practical difficulty in adhering to the 3-foot ordinance. Secondly, the proposed fence height increase is not a reasonable use of the land. The fence in the front yard setback limited to 3 feet if solid, which this fence is, or 4 feet if open or decorative, is to maintain an open front yard setback and to maintain a uniform built environment. This fence, staff argues, does not. This fence encroaching into the front yard at 6 feet in height does disrupt that built environment, and also does limit visibility into and out of the site.
Excuse me, we have a question from Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you. So isn't the point of that to create uniformity in a place where you can see it? So for example, you have a normal street that has a yard that goes 20 feet back, and so you wouldn't want a 6-foot fence where people could be walking by and they could be seeing it. Isn't that the purpose of that finding?
Yes,
And
general
you, and you
visibility.
would agree here that you can't walk by because it's like 30 feet in the air and they're way up on a steep slope and no one would see this fence. I'm unclear as to why you couldn't make the finding that this would not be, that this wouldn't be a problem on that point alone because you don't see it. The purpose of that is to make sure that we don't have people building 6-foot fences kind of at the street level. This is, what you're showing is way up high.
Correct.
No one sees that except for the immediate next door neighbor.
Sure. The proposed variance will alter the essential character of the area. There is a fairly uniform built environment demonstrating the houses, and this fence, 20 feet of that in the front yard, does disrupt that uniform built environment. While the zoning code doesn't necessarily protect views from private properties, the view of the lake as well as the skyline are disrupted by this fence. Then with the shoreland overlay, the first finding is regarding soil erosion. The fence is constructed during a site visit in November. There was no erosion present either on site or down at the parkway. Secondly, limiting the visibility of structures from the protected water. This photo was taken from the parkway, obviously Cedar Lake being the protected water. We can see the 6-foot fence is very visible from the parkway. A 3-foot fence, as granted by the board. Would a 3-foot fence be limiting the visibility? Yes. Is the 6-foot limiting the visibility? No. And finally, there are no watercraft associated with this variance. So with that, staff recommends the Zoning and Planning Committee, my apologies, adapt staff's findings and deny the appeal to increase the fence height from 3 feet to 6 feet.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions for staff? And then we'll open the public hearing. Okay, there are none. We'll open the public hearing, and anyone who would like to speak, please come on up, state your name and address for the record. We'd also, if you haven't, please do sign in with the clerk before or after you speak, just so we have your written information.
Good morning. My name is Melissa Pollock. Chairman Bender, members of the committee, thank you very much for hearing our appeal. Respectfully, I'd like to disagree. I think we face a substantial practical difficulty in complying with the ordinance as written. We understand that the ordinance refers to the lake side of our yard as our front yard, but in all practical respects, it's the backyard. We can't, the UPS guy can't drive up to our front yard. We receive guests, from the quote unquote backyard. In all ways, our yards facing the alley serve front yard functions, and our yards facing the lake serve backyard functions. Unfortunately, I don't have color pictures, but let's see, which way does this go? Like this. So that is our back. This is what is officially our front yard, but functionally our backyard. Here's a picture of our official backyard and functional front yard. So the fence ordinance really does recognize that privacy is an appropriate backyard amenity, and allowing a 6-foot tall privacy fence seems appropriate in our situation. Frankly, the size and of the home built next door after the tear down on that property exacerbates the need for privacy in our backyard. The new construction sits at the minimum distance from the property line. It reaches the maximum height. And, also, frankly, zoning variances that were granted for that tear down have exacerbated this problem. Zoning variances reduced the established front yard setback for that property and increased the maximum floor area ratio for that property. So our situation as a whole, which includes the quirk of the property layout and the scale of the new construction really presents us a practical difficulty in complying with the ordinance as written. The other points I'd like to make is that I would disagree that the fence has a detrimental effect on the essential character of the neighborhood or on the built environment. And, I think actually this photo makes that point. The other point or bit of evidence I would raise about that is the extraordinary support that we have received from the neighbors in favor of the fence and that it's attractive and appropriate. I don't know if you received in your packets copies of the petition that people signed. There have been subsequent emails from a number of other neighbors, and we have neighbors here today to speak in support of the fence. Finally, one final point on the issue of the fence disrupting the view from the next door neighbor property. This is a picture, Andrew had a picture taken in the winter. This is a picture taken from their property, and I would make the point that their view of the city skyline and the lake is framed by the trees here, not by our fence. So it doesn't really mess with their view. All in all, the peculiar situation of our lot presents us a practical difficulty in complying with the fence ordinance, and we ask that you grant a variance, essentially applying backyard rules, which would allow a 6-foot-tall privacy fence in our case. Thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you. The next person may come on up and please state your name and address for the record.
Council, thank you. My name is Timothy Kane. I'm a neighbor of Melissa Pollux and David Pollux. We have lived there since 1987. We are here in support of her request for this fence. We feel that it is in keeping with the neighborhood and in keeping with the built environment. We do not see it as a detriment to the neighborhood at all. The whole aspect and nature of our specific block, so to speak, is unique in the city of Minneapolis. As Melissa indicated, the lakeside access to our property is fundamentally our backyard. It's where we have our deck, where we do our barbecuing, where we sit and eat in the summertime and enjoy nature, which is the lake. All deliveries, all access is through the opposite side of the house. So the whole thing is flip-flopped, where in a normal environment, in a normal city block, you have a very clear front and backyard. That is not the case in our block area. So I'd like to reiterate that and reiterate our support for Melissa's request, and thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? Come on up.
Hello, I'm David Pollock, Melissa's husband. I thought she covered most of the points. But, you know, the issue about the fence not fitting into the neighborhood character, I mean, ideally there would be no fence. There wouldn't be a need for the fence. You know, we didn't need one when before the previous house was torn down. And it was just more modest and wasn't encroaching on us. And so that need for privacy didn't have to be staked out maybe like this. But, you know, so comparatively though, I think the fence fits into the neighborhood character. You notice that the new construction, like the highest point of it is toward the lake where it's visible from down below. You know, so if exceptions are being granted for that construction, it seems only fair that we get comparative allowances for our much more modest structure. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? Anyone else? Last call. Seeing none, I will close the public hearing. Just a reminder, please sign in with your name and address with the clerk. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to move to grant the appeal and direct staff to draft findings with regard to the issue specifically of practical difficulties. This is not a tough call. I don't know the Pollocks. I've never met them. I've never talked to them. They've tried to talk to me, actually, but I wouldn't talk to them. And so this is the first time I'm seeing this, and it just seems very, very obvious. This is an area clearly where the front yard is the backyard. And I don't know, did we not go out and look at this? Are we unfamiliar as a staff with the conditions out there? I mean, this is like 2 stories above the grade. And so it's very clear, since all of the house's entrances face the alley, that that is really the front yard. So this seems like a very strict adherence over something minor like a fence. And it seems somewhat unfair that they would have to pay a fee, take the time, go through the Board of Adjustment, and come down here today over a fence. So I'm a little bit distressed that it got to this point, to be honest with you. So I would just ask staff to draft findings and take that into consideration if we see further situations that look like this.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. I agree. Thank you so much for going through the process, and see if there's any further discussion. Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And that carries. That moves us to item number 2, which is variance and site plan review appeal related to parking the Wells Fargo site on Lake Street.
Good morning, Chair Bender and committee members. The application before us at this point is an appeal of the decision of the Planning Commission related to 2 applications for the Wells Fargo Bank at 1505 West Lake Street. The Planning Commission on November 16th denied a variance to the maximum parking requirement for this project, as well as attaching a condition of approval to their site plan that required them to meet the maximum parking requirement. So those are the 2 items that are subject of today's appeal. The project site is located on Lake Street. It's a uniquely shaped parcel as outlined in the dark black here, with frontage both on Irving and Humboldt. The site currently has 49 parking stalls. The applicant is proposing to redevelop the site, put the bank building at the corner, and as part of that, the parking lot would be redeveloped as well and have 36 parking stalls. The maximum parking allowance for this use is 17 stalls. So while it's a reduction over the 49 stalls currently, it's more than double their maximum parking requirement. Staff finds that there are no practical difficulties that exist in complying with the ordinance, in this case with the maximum parking requirement, and there are no unique circumstances to justify that request. The statement submitted by the applicant essentially asserts that the need for the parking variance is due to the high number of employees that drive to the site. A travel demand management plan was prepared for this project, and as part of that, it noted that of the 27 employees who currently work on site, 100% of them drive. The travel demand management plan had a mode share goal of getting 90% of the employees to drive, with 5% biking and 5% taking transit to the site. The mode share goal for customers was for 70% of customers to drive, with the balance made up of walking, biking, and taking transit to the site. Those mode share goals are really low, particularly given the pedestrian-oriented nature of this area. This site is in a pedestrian-oriented overlay district. The site is uniquely situated close to bus transit with access to lines in either direction with service every 15 minutes. It is 2 blocks south of the Midtown Greenway Bike Trail, 3 blocks east of the Grand Rounds, and about 3 blocks away from the Uptown Transit Center, which provides access via transit to the rest of the city and the parts of the greater metro. The area is walkable and densely populated. Given the access to bike and transit facilities, it's likely that a much higher number of employees and customers can and will use alternate modes of transportation instead of driving to the site. The mode split approved on previous TDMPs this year was closer to 55% for single occupancy vehicles, and here we're looking at 90 for employees and 70 for customers. Again, the variance is more than double the maximum requirement and would not be reasonable or in keeping with the spirit and intent of the ordinance or the comprehensive plan. When the Uptown Small Area Plan was adopted in 2008, one of the main goals of that plan was to make this area more walkable, more bikeable, and to improve streets for those types of activities. There are several supporting policies in the plan that talk about walking and biking being the preferred mode of travel for local needs. The plan also specifically encourages employers to increase transit use for employees by participating in the MetroPass program. Staff had recommended a denial of the applications based on those findings and had recommended conditions of approval that the applicant participate in the MetroPass program and make bike parking more visible in lieu of providing the number of parking stalls that are proposed. I'd like to call your attention to a couple of things in your packet. So after this went to Planning Commission, the applicant did put together a revised site plan that shows 25 parking stalls. So it's a reduction over what went to the Planning Commission, which was 36, but still exceeds their maximum parking requirement. So again, their maximum is 17. So this is 25. The parking stalls that were removed from the south part of the parking lot here where it's adjacent to residential zoning and from this driveway that comes in from Irving. If this weren't in the pedestrian-oriented overlay district, they would be allowed 28 parking stalls. So even if this weren't in the PO, this would still exceed. It would be within what they're allowed. So it's just something for comparison's sake here that they have proposed this other option. But again, the same findings would need to be made, and staff hasn't found any practical difficulty or unique circumstances here. Also, the neighborhood contacted me yesterday. They were going to submit another letter, but there should be one in your packets. I told them I would call that out because it might be buried deep somewhere in the staff report. But we did get a letter of recommendation from the neighborhood to actually approve the variance. And there's a letter from one neighbor in there as well. So I'll close with that and stand for any questions.
Any questions? There are none, so we can go ahead with the public hearing. I will open the public hearing, invite the applicant to begin, and we can take further testimony from there.
Hi, good morning. Brian Reno with Stantec Architecture for Wells Fargo Bank. I think really our practical difficulty and the reason that we've come all the way to an appeal is that our true practical difficulty is this is not a theoretical use or a new use to the site. The big picture here is Wells Fargo has 2 locations across Humboldt Avenue from each other. And they're consolidating and right-sizing the facility to meet today's needs in the marketplace. So their lease at the adjacent Sons of Norway building is coming to an end. They own this property that currently just has a very large drive-up on it. And to right-size to today's needs, they are reducing the drive-up from 7 lanes to 2 lanes. But they know today that they have 22 employees that will remain on the site. They know today they have an average of 20 to 25 customers that utilize parking at peak times. They know that today. That's what exists, and that's the reason our TDM plan proposed those averages. These are things that we know and can see today. Wells Fargo does support the MetroPass program, and they would certainly they certainly encourage a whole range of green policies, from green building and getting their employees to use transit, but we can't change the reality of the fact that many people that use the bank today still drive there, and that a large percentage of the employees, based upon where they can afford to live and where they live today, commute to the site via automobile. Also, we know that from a safety perspective, we like to have a certain amount of parking near our entry door. So we have accommodated that at our rear entry. We have made many changes to the site plan to comply with every other aspect of the pedestrian overlay district. We've positioned the building on the corner of the site. We've created a very pedestrian-oriented entrance at the corner of the site. We've actually also put a walk-up ATM at the corner of the site. So, and our site will probably be the most heavily landscaped commercial site anywhere in this district, if not in all of Minneapolis. We have a very high landscaping ratio. We've already removed the majority of our parking spaces, but our primary concern is, again, we know what our employee count is. We know what our customer usage is, and we do not want to cause a problem to the neighborhood or to cause traffic congestion because our customers and employees are forced to park on surrounding streets. So it's really, our practical difficulty really comes down to the actual conditions on the ground today. The site was originally developed in 1970 as a completely drive-up oriented site. We're really changing it to primarily pedestrian oriented, but we do have a legitimate need for parking to accommodate our bank customers and our employees today. And with that, I would love to take any questions that you have.
Are there any questions for the applicant? Okay, there are none. Would anyone else like to speak? Come on up and please state your name and address for the record. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Sally Head. I live across the street from Wells Fargo. I'm at 3029 Humboldt. And my request for you today is to give them any and all parking spaces that they ask for. Parking in Uptown and on Humboldt is a problem. There are not enough spots, and my guests frequently tell me that they hate coming to my house because there's not enough places to park. Eliminated needed parking spaces hurts the residents and the surrounding businesses. The suggestion that adding a bike rack will mitigate the problem is ludicrous. And I'm not anti-biking, and I'm not anti-busing. In fact, I work in Bloomington, and I got a certificate from the city for my efforts to bike to work. In fact, my family owns a multi-million-dollar company making bicycle wheels. So I'm not anti-biking, and I'm not anti-bus. However, the workers in Uptown, whom I talk to, don't really ride the bus. So because we're in a busy bus area, and although we have this great access to public transportation and the bike trail, which is the reason I live there, the assertion that people will just ride the bus is simply not true. Adrian from Great Clips, as well as Marcia and Georgianne from Lunds, all live in Linden Hills, and all of them drive to work. And they park on Humboldt. They could have a beautiful ride around the lakes to work every day, but they don't. Several other workers I talk to at the shops, such as Blush and Mac and all the other things at Calhoun Square, a lot of those people live in Ridgefield, Bloomington, St. Louis Park. Again, those are very easy bus rides on the bike trail, yet they drive. And they park on Humboldt. Why? Because it's the closest street to Calhoun Square without meters. In the summer, with the recreational traffic, it's even worse. Adrian has to park 3 to 4 blocks down on Humboldt because it's full. If these workers are not riding the bus, it's unrealistic to expect that Wells Fargo employees will take the bus, and even more unrealistic to assume that Bob Johnson from Brooklyn Park, who's coming down to get his mortgage, is going to take the bus. And he's certainly not going to ride his bike with an armful of papers to sign his mortgage. I applaud the efforts to encourage biking and public transportation. But if you can't get people like Adrienne, Georgianne, and Marcia to ride the bus, the programs are ineffective. And eliminating existing parking spaces will only cause hardships to the residents, our guests, and to all the surrounding businesses in the area, not just Wells Fargo. Traffic and parking is a hot issue in East Calhoun, and the neighborhood supports more parking spaces for Wells Fargo. I applaud their efforts for more green space and think that Wells Fargo has adequately addressed that with their landscaping. I live across the street and I have to look at it every day. I think it's fine. I really like the fact that they're going away from more of a drive-through aspect. Again, do not create additional parking problems in Uptown. Please give Wells Fargo all the parking spaces they request. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? Anyone else?
I would just like to, in case you didn't see it in your packet, we have a letter from the East Calhoun Community Association in support of our parking variance for 36 spaces. And since I didn't say it before, I wanted to reiterate that we did provide bike parking on both sides of our building and bike lockers and so forth. And that we feel that we have complied with every other aspect of the pedestrian-oriented district, but we know that overlay and the parking requirements in it don't suit the present activity for Wells Fargo, its customers, and the community, and that's why we've come here today to appeal. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Goodman.
I'm just wondering, do you allow for these 36 spots to be used by others when you're not operating the bank? How is this helping the neighborhood get rid of parking?
We did discuss that.
No, come on up to the microphone. So I mean, I can maybe understand it would be helpful to the neighborhood if the parking was available in snow emergencies overnight, or if people can use the spots for valet for other businesses when you're not operating. I would assume that bank is open till what, 5?
Six Monday through Friday.
What happens after 6 o'clock and on Saturdays and Sundays?
Nothing at this point. But
Why?
We had a meeting with the Echo board and they asked that same question, and we were open to discussing the possibilities of evening parking and
Weekends?
so forth. Correct. Yep.
So, Madam Chair, I'm not going to support the request unless that's a condition of it. This happens in my ward downtown all the time, where you make the argument you need a lot of parking for your employees for the hours you're open, but if you're not, then if there's an empty surface parking lot sitting there with all of this great need in Uptown on weekends and at nights, then it's just a blight, in my opinion. So I'm not this is not my word, but I'm not going to support the request unless a condition is added that they work out something to use that parking at nights or weekends. I don't actually think you should be building a one-story building in this location. So, I mean, I'm way on the other side of where you guys are at.
Well, yeah. Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. Would anyone else like to speak before I close the public hearing? Anyone else? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing. We have lots of comments and questions from council members. Councilmember Andrew Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to say that I completely agree with Councilmember Goodman, and having previously worked a lot on Lake Street projects, it's just, it needs density, it needs more than one story, and there's way too much surface parking just in general. So thank you.
Kimberly, do you happen to know the FAR offhand? Because that's the real problem here. And I think perhaps I should have encouraged the neighborhood board to add more context to their letter. When Ben and I go monthly to the meetings, which we do, the conversation there has really been about how do we get this project to totally change into a different form that's not a single story building surrounded by surface parking. And I really have appreciated how much Wells Fargo has been responsive to the design concerns that the Planning Commission and the neighborhood had expressed. It's come leaps and bounds, but I think the real problem here is it's a single story building surrounded by something. And I think the neighborhood organization, at least I don't want to speak for them, but in my conversations with board members and others, the sort of question has been, well, if it's going to be surrounded by something, maybe it might as well be parking. I think that was sort of their feeling. But I think the real problem is we don't have FAR standards that require something more than what they have. So anyway, that's kind of getting off track, but I just wanted to give some context to the neighborhood's position on the parking. And again, but the legal question we're really asking is, do they meet the standards for the variance for asking for more parking?
To answer your original question, this is a 4,500 square foot building on a site that's just under an acre for an FAR of 0.1. So in some of our pedestrian-oriented overlay districts, we do require a minimum FAR of 1.0. That's not the case in this particular pedestrian-oriented overlay district. That's something we've had a lot of conversation about. Certainly
Let's do that.
do not disagree with you that we would like to see more density here. Unfortunately, in this case, there was nothing that required them to build a 2-story building.
Thank you. That's helpful. Was there any other questions or comments from council members? Is it possible to add that condition? It seems.
Madam Chair, you're referring to Councilmember Goodman's. Yes, I think it would be. You could apply to, if the committee is inclined to approve the variance to either 36 or 25 spaces based on the revised proposal, you could attach it to that approval.
And if I could just clarify, we'll just have to make sure the condition reads something about shared parking and making that parking free so it doesn't become a commercial parking lot and then we have other applications that would be required. So as long as it's some sort of shared parking arrangement, that's.
What is the maximum allowed parking?
The maximum allowed is 17.
Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I want to make it clear that when we say shared, we don't mean let's put a price on it for games at $7 a turn and that everyone's coming in. I mean an agreement with a restaurant or a coffee shop in the area that has parking needs that can share it through valet, even if they have to pay a fee. It wouldn't be a Class A commercial licensed parking lot. If there's going to be parking in this location, it needs to be available. I think about the people who have to park their cars on the streets on Humboldt during snow emergencies. Where do they go? Yeah, maybe there's a way it can be a snow emergency lot like we see downtown as well. So I think that if we're going to do it, we better make sure it's an actual benefit to the community and there's a community benefit provided. Otherwise, it's not worth doing.
I have to say, I'm inclined to move to deny the variance completely. I really have struggled finding the support to allow them to exceed the maximum in this pedestrian overlay district. So I'm going to move to deny the variance. Council President.
Madam Chair, I'd offer a substitute to approve the variance with the language that Mr. Nielsen suggested. And Madam Chair, if I could just speak to it for a second, I'm compelled by the neighborhood argument that when you have an existing use and you know how many people are going to park there, those people will be parking in front of people's houses, and that is neighborhood. Far be it for me to try and intrude in somebody's ward, but it's clear this is a neighborhood. I've been out there trying to shop, and parking is a huge issue. So I think it's again this push to try to force people to use particular kinds of transportation is getting to the point that people have had it up to their eyeballs. So that's my motion. It does include the shared parking. It does.
If we consider that alternative, I would encourage us to go with the alternative proposal of 25 spaces, which the applicant has brought forward.
That'd be fine, Madam Chair.
Okay. So then Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would hope that procedurally that we would understand that the agreement would be, the basic outline of the agreement would be reviewable by the full council meeting. And if it weren't in place, that they would expect that we would deny it at council, that we would have a written outline of the agreement, which is to put staff and the applicant on notice that we would want that in place in time for review.
Thank you, Councilmember Reich. I think that's an excellent suggestion. Okay. So, I think the overall context here, I think, is important to understand, which is that there is an adopted small area plan that had the support of the community, including the neighborhood organization, which called for density here. And that's why there's a pedestrian overlay district in place with the very loose, frankly, regulations that encourage walkable urban, the walkable urban form that the community requested through the small area plan. Given the context here, what will the space be used for if it's not used for parking? I think that is an important question for us to consider. And so I'm willing to support this compromise here with the 25 spaces as long as they are accessible to others. I still think over time we're not honoring the community's desire to move toward a more walkable uptown area, but really that has more to do with our lacking in the FAR regulations, I think, than the parking regulations in this case. So, Kimberly, did you have something to add?
I just wanted to seek clarification on Councilmember Reich's points. Are you looking for, if Councilmember Johnson's motion were to be approved, an actual shared parking agreement with a specific user, or just a general commitment from Wells Fargo that they would allow for shared parking on the site?
Madam Chair, I would say that the latter would be appropriate.
Okay, great.
Okay, so just to clarify, we have a motion from Council President Johnson that to approve the variance for 25 parking spaces total, with the condition added that there be a written statement that there be a shared parking agreement with some future neighborhood entity. Does that sound right? Okay. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in approval, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And that carries. Thank you.
Madam Chair, there's just a second part of that. You also want to make a motion on the site plan review condition. There was condition number 3, limited it to 17 stalls as well.
Thank you, Mr. Nielsen. So on item number 2, I will move. So it would be. So we want to increase the number to 25 in that statement. So we would approve the condition subject to changing it to 25.
Correct. Yep. You'd move to grant the appeal and modify that condition to reflect the revised proposal of 25 spaces.
Thank you, Mr. Nielsen. So I will move to modify condition of approval number 3 to allow for 25 parking stalls. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And that carries. That concludes item 2, and then that will move us to item number 3, which is 112 East Hennepin Avenue. And this is a discussion, just so everyone is clear, of conditions of approval that have come through the Heritage Preservation Commission. This hasn't been to the CPC.
Thank you.
Good morning, Chair Bender, members of the committee. This is an appeal of the Heritage Preservation Commission's actions from December 1st for the property at 112 East Hennepin Avenue. So some background, the property is located in the Nicollet Island East Bank neighborhood. It's located in the St. Anthony Falls Historic District, which has been designated since 1971. You're probably familiar with the site. It's the current location of the Nye's restaurant. The site is 4 separate buildings and then a large surface parking lot. Currently, there's 2 historic buildings, as you can see, and then 2 one-story buildings that were built in the 1960s that exist today. This is what Hennepin Avenue looked like when you were crossing the river in 1912. So you can see the 2 historic buildings identified on the right. There aren't a ton of historic photos of these properties. Here's some pictures of what the property looked like in 1967. So the applicants or the applications that went before the Heritage Preservation Commission were 2 certificates of appropriateness. So the first certificate of appropriateness was to allow the demolition of those 2 one-story buildings, which are non-contributing resources in the St. Anthony Falls Historic District. The second certificate of appropriateness was to allow exterior changes to the remaining historic buildings, and then to allow a new 6-story building to be constructed, which would be attached to those historic buildings. So the HPC action on that first certificate of appropriateness, they voted 10-0 to approve the C of A to allow the demolition of those 2 one-story structures. And then the action on the second certificate of appropriateness, was 6-4 to approve the C of A for the exterior alterations in the new construction, subject to 10 separate conditions of approval. Staff had originally recommended 12. The HPC struck 2 of those recommended conditions of approval, but the remainder of the conditions of approval were originally recommended by staff and adopted by the HPC. The applicant is only appealing 4 of the conditions, so those are the ones with the arrows next to them. So we'll just focus on those today. So this is an image of the proposal. So it's essentially 4 to 6 stories of new construction. It's a mixed-use project with 71 dwelling units. There would be retail all along Hennepin. There would be 1 level of underground parking and then a level of parking at the rear. On the ground level, there would be parking at the rear. The residential entrance would be on 2nd Street, and then there would be retail entrances all along Hennepin Avenue. So those conditions of approval that were recommended and that are being appealed today were all based upon the St. Anthony Falls Historic District Design Guidelines, which were adopted in 2012. So I'll go through each one of the 4. So the first one is related to building equipment. The design guideline that was adopted says that projects should minimize the visual impacts of their building equipment as seen from the public way, and specifically that primary wall penetrations for HVAC equipment are not permitted and should not be located on a primary facade. The proposal includes individual HVAC units, which are kind of typically called magic packs, but that's just a brand. So they're proposing magic packs on all 3 primary facades of the new construction. So the Hennepin Avenue facade, you can see them circled. The Lord's Place facade, again circled, and the 2nd Street facade. And because that's a very specific condition of approval, staff recommended and the HPC adopted a condition of approval that the HVAC penetration should not be located on elevations facing a public street because there are 2 historic buildings, a new infill building that they're proposing, and then the larger 6-story building. There's a lot going on the site, and there's, by minimizing the HVAC units, that's one less thing that's cluttering the facades of the buildings. Also, just for example, these HVAC units are used pretty typically in these type of apartment or mixed-use 4 to 6-story buildings. Just an example of how they look when they're actually constructed. There's some around town. And then just going back to that specific guideline, in their appeal statement, the applicant asserts that because these HVAC units have been approved for other projects, and they have been approved for other projects, specifically in the St. Anthony Falls Historic District, that they, in order to be consistent, that they should be approved for this project as well. And I just want to remind you that guidelines are guidelines, and they're intended to be applied on a case-by-case basis. And the fact that they are approved for one project, every site is different, and it doesn't mean that they have to be approved on every project. The next subject was, or the next condition of approval was related to roof decks. And so the design guideline that was adopted says that projects should minimize the impact of roof decks as seen from the street. And the way to do that is to typically set back the guardrails for a roof deck at least 1 structural bay or 15 feet. The applicants had originally proposed, so there's a kind of amenity roof deck that's on top of the harness shop building, the historic building in the center, which would be accessible to all of the tenants of the building. And then there's a private roof deck on the newer infill metal panel portion to the right of that. They had originally proposed both of those to be set back at 8 feet. When they brought it to the HPC meeting, they had changed it. And then in the appeal document, they are showing pulling the roof deck all the way to the front of the harness shop building, so no setback, and then pushing back the one on the newer building. Because that's a very specific design guideline, staff recommended and the HPC adopted a condition of approval that all roof deck railings shall be set back at least 15 feet from the building edge along the street to minimize the visual impact of the roof deck. It should be noted, and maybe the applicant can speak to it more, that they're hoping to be able to use the parapet of the building as a railing. There are building code requirements associated with that, so there's a chance that they wouldn't actually need a railing. But if they don't need the railing, that condition of approval still being in place would, they could still place the roof deck all the way up to the front of the building if they can use the parapet as the railing. If that makes sense. Next up is materials. So the design guideline shown here says that building materials should be essentially similar in scale, color, and texture to those that were historically in place in the historic context of the historic district, and that a facade facing a public street should have just one principal material and then a few accent materials. Staff found that the applicants proposing on a majority of the new construction, this 6th floor addition, to be this champagne colored metal panel, where the rest of the new construction is essentially 2 different colors of brick, and then the historic buildings are 2 other colors of brick. So staff found that historically a building would never have had the top floor of a building would never have been a completely different material from the rest of the building. And so because that didn't exist historically, staff found that if the metal panel was darker, maybe to match the brick, or if they brought the brick all the way up to the 6th floor, that would be more in keeping with the historic character of the area. And then finally, the 4th condition is related. This is the interior side of the property, or the new proposal, which faces the Our Lady of Lourdes Church and Rectory building. And on this side, they're proposing at the ground level, well, in their application packet, they proposed burnished block, concrete block. They've since updated that, and they're now proposing it to be precast concrete. But staff found that that's introducing an entirely new material to this side of the building. They do rack the brick a little bit around the corners, but because it's adding essentially a new principal material that doesn't match the other sides of the building, staff recommended that a condition of approval, and the HPC adopted that condition of approval, that the concrete block, or precast concrete, I suppose, proposed would be replaced with brick that would match the floors above. I would also note that this is a large blank wall, which is going to become an issue when they come forward for land use applications and site plan review. So that will also need to be addressed at Planning Commission. As far as public comments,
Ms. Steiner, can I clarify that those were then a certificate of appropriateness items 4, 5, 9, and 10?
Correct.
Okay.
Or wait. Yeah, I'm sorry. The presentation has the numbers from the original HPC hearing, but correct. It's 4, 5, 9, and 10. Yes.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Yeah, it got renumbered once they struck a couple.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks.
So yeah, just a couple more things. No public comments were received for the HPC hearing, but 2 public comments were received for this appeal, which should be in your packet. One was a neighbor who was concerned about the proposed materials, and the second was a representative of the Our Lady of Lourdes Church who said that they had no objection to the appeal. And so I'll just leave those 4 conditions of approval up on the screen and take any questions.
Any questions? Seeing none, we will open the public hearing. We can start with the applicant and then take comment from there.
Good afternoon. My name is Aaron Rosseth with ESG Architects. I'm here with Schaefer Richardson, Amy Lucas, the historical consultant, and Carol Lansing, the attorney helping us on this project. We're all here for questions, but I'm going to give a very brief presentation on in a consolidated version of what you have in your packages. The preservation of the buildings at 112 and 116 East Hennepin is made possible through the redevelopment of this whole site. We've taken a lot of care to preserve and thoughtfully build around these buildings to create a project that honors the historic character of the district while creating a vibrant community that adds life and character to the neighborhood. There are 4 of the 10 conditions we seek to strike from the certificate of appropriateness. One of those we are willing to withdraw from the application, which would be item 4, or excuse me, condition 10. The owners agreed that brick would be appropriate in that area. So we'd like to talk about conditions 4, 5, and 9 briefly. The magic packs, we've made a major effort to minimize the impact, moving all of the magic packs as much as possible off of Hennepin Avenue facade, the primary facade, and where feasible, or where we needed to put them in because of certain unit plans, we've tried to blend them into the adjacent materials where they're painted the same color. We have a number of examples that have been approved by the HPC in the past in other buildings in historic districts throughout the city of Minneapolis. Figure 1 and Figure 2 is Mill and Main, and both of those projects have magic packs on all 4 facades of the buildings. And one of the things to note here is this project is directly adjacent to a national landmark as well. Another project that has recently been approved by HPC with magic packs is 100 Hennepin. You can see in this where a very similar approach that we've taken on this project, where the grills are painted to match the adjacent material. On the lower portion, the brick material with the grills painted to match as best as possible, and then the metal panel on top, a similar approach. Another project, Dock Street, that was approved by the HBC with magic packs on primary facades. And again, the same strategy was used to blend it in with the overall color. And to the right, North 4th Avenue facade, the Paxson building. So before I go to number 5, we just simply request that the city demonstrates consistency in administration of the historic district guidelines. These other projects have been approved, and we believe that we're using the very similar strategies that we've done in the past for those projects that were approved. Condition number 5, roof deck setback. We're proposing to place the roof deck at the edge and treat an existing guardrail, if possible, as the railing. We asked for this to be struck, and the goal is to use this parapet as the guardrail. There's a significant amount of restructuring that we have to do, so we ask for leniency in this to be open. If we have to add a small guardrail, that we will minimize the impact of that as much as possible. This just to communicate that there's other examples that national parks and state preservation organizations throughout the country have approved this. The example on the right is a hotel in, excuse me, in Virginia that was approved with the guardrail and a rooftop deck going to the edge. And recently, the Pioneer Endicott building in St. Paul also was approved through SHPO and national parks. One of the reasons we want to pull this to the edge is we think that having activity that is in the building outside is a really cool way to sort of interact with the pedestrian realm, where people are outside enjoying a rooftop deck, and it just creates more eyes on the street. And we believe it's a really good pedestrian sort of connection that interacts with the building. This is a floor plan of where you see that. Condition 9, we've utilized a strategy that is in the guidelines of a base, middle, and a top. We believe that this color is appropriate. It's a champagne colored metal that is playing off the brick color that we have below. We think that this is subjective, but we believe that it strongly suggests a very good, clear answer to the base, middle, top. and we believe that it blends in really beautifully with the composition of the rest of the building. With that, we're here for questions.
Are there any questions for the applicant? There are none.
Thank you.
So we'll go ahead and see if anyone else would like to come up and speak. Would anyone else like to speak? Anyone else? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing. Councilmember Fry, would you like to make some comments?
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I'd like to reflect on the evolution of this project over the last year and a half. This was initially a development consisting of 29 to 30 stories. Obviously, there was quite a bit of pushback from the adjacent church and some surrounding neighborhoods, and the end result has been a beautiful and significant compromise. We're now looking at approximately 6 stories, but this is not just any 6-story stick frame building. It constitutes approximately 5 different buildings, and the overarching goal in the Senhen neighborhood, which of course refers to Central and Hennepin, is to create a collage of historical eras. So we don't need to freeze time at 1890, at 1910, or 1950, or 2005. We can evolve, we can grow, and we can create a diversity of eras, height, and people that make cities really interesting. And you see this all throughout Europe. You see this in New York City. You can have different heights, different facades, types of buildings, and it really makes the area exciting. And the concepts of growth and historic preservation are not mutually exclusive, and this project is really proving it in a great way. So I'm just going to go through all 3 items now, not 4, since the item number 10 has since been taken off. So first, we wanted to maximize the number of eyes on East Hennepin. So when we looked at the harness shop building, which if you look at your screen right now, that's the approximately 3-story building that's got harness shop written across the top of it. The perfect idea was for some form of plaza. Now, if you move the railing back, as was suggested by HPC, then you're not going to get the eyes on the street. You're going to get the eyes on the floor. And that doesn't help very much. So I would strongly urge my colleagues to grant the appeal of Schaefer Richardson on that item so that we can have some additional eyes on the street. The second item, and I'm not sure I'm going in the correct order right now, but the second item is the color. There was an individual as part of a design team that did quite a bit of research to determine what colors would look good with the surrounding area as well as the adjacent buildings, and they determined that the color that you see before you would work quite well. I have infamously bad taste, but I'm obliged to trust those who are paid to do the work rather than a relatively ambiguous request that the color be a little bit darker. And so I would ask that you grant that appeal as well. The third one is related to the jet magic packs. I keep saying jet packs. And the magic packs, there is quite a precedent for allowing magic packs in developments in historic districts. And given that this development includes approximately 5 different buildings, having central air would likely be cost prohibitive. But apart from the cost prohibition, again, there's a precedent. And I think it just makes sense. So I would ask that you grant that appeal as well. And then the final item, which is number 10, I thank the developer for removing that item because I do think that a brick bottom located just next to the church will, I think, work off of each other and play off of each other very well. So I thank you for removing that one because if you hadn't, I was going to ask my colleagues to not grant the appeal. So all in all, I think this is a beautiful project. It's a wonderful compromise, and I think it'll add quite a bit to the neighborhood. And I encourage my colleagues to vote for the appeal on 4, 5, and 9.
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Fry, for coming and making that statement. I'll go ahead and make that motion then. So I'll move to, which actually I had independently come to those conclusions as well. I think this is a beautiful building. So move to approve the appeal for item 4, 5, and 9. Has 10 been officially withdrawn, or should we just move to deny? item.
As part of, Madam Chair, as part of your motion, you could just move to accept the withdrawal on 10.
So again, the motion is to move to approve the appeal for certificate of appropriateness items 4, 5, and 9, and to accept the withdrawal of item 10 under the certificate of appropriateness. Is there any discussion? Council President.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I agree with Councilmember Fry. I think what we have in front of us is a really exciting development in an area that I am very, very familiar with. My family had a business just down another block down East Hennepin for many, many years. And that's a reuse of an existing building. It was a funeral home and a furniture store. The furniture store burned, and now it's a lovely patio there next to the funeral home turned restaurant. It's strange to go in there. Let me tell you, as someone who spent time on East Hennepin as a young woman with my father and his brothers who had that business, this area of the city has changed so very much. But it has the essential elements of what made it a great neighborhood. And this particular development, I think, really respects that history, but again, brings it into the next century where, we have changing needs as a city, and the cities always change. And I'm really excited about this. I'm glad that the developer worked with the church next door, Lady of Lourdes, and I think it's historic because I was baptized there, but whatever. That is a remarkable, beautiful church. When River Place was developed, they were very careful to make sure that they didn't block the view of Our Lady of Lourdes down to the riverfront. And this, I think, respects the church and has worked with the church, and that's really important to me. So I'm delighted to see this. I think it'll be a great addition to Northeast Minneapolis, and look forward to seeing it come to fruition.
Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to say kudos to the developers on the design of this. I happen to have Hiawatha Avenue in Ward 12, and we have a lot of large developments there which don't offer a lot of visual change throughout the structure. They can be just like big, long, blocky buildings. And I think this is what's so remarkable about this is that you are varying different materials and heights, and it has such visual interest and contrast, and I think will absolutely enhance the streetscape and hopefully be an inspiration for other developments to come. And so I just think top-notch work on the design is very, very intriguing, very great.
Any further discussion? No, I will note, I can see this. I can see going either way on this condition 9. So I did want to sort of state for staff and the HPC, I see where that impetus was coming from to really kind of want that to be more of an historic building. And with this design, it just looks like more of a modern building. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that we are kind of making that policy choice here. So if there's any further discussion, seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And that carries. We do have a brief presentation now here for items 6 and 7. This is an appeal of, this is a designation. But the HPC recommended designating one of the buildings that had been nominated by Councilmember Yang, but not designating the other building. So I thought a presentation was in order, and so we'll start with staff. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Jim Vole. I'm a city planner in the Long Range Planning Division of CPED. The site is just west of Interstate 94 on West Broadway, the north side, the north side of West Broadway and the north side of Minneapolis. There are two buildings there, 404 and 410 West Broadway, but they're under one parcel, one tax ID, and one ownership, and they were nominated together. But through the process, we ended up splitting them out into two designation studies and two actions. So my presentation will mix a little bit of both of them as I go through. But 404 is a former Independent Order of Oddfellows building from about 1897 to around 1975, and then it was used as a commercial building after that. And 410 was at one time a White Castle from 1927 to 43, and then was various diners or restaurants most recently the Broadway Diner up until 1977. Just an aerial view of it. The 410 building, the 404, the Oddfellows building. To the west is the whole Kemp's Dairy, and to the east is 400, the Gatzenmeyer building, or most people know it as Friedman's Department Store. That's also a potential historic resource. And I should say that the two buildings that we're talking about today are owned by Kemp's, the property owner. To the west, this is just a picture of the former restaurant, White Castle, the former Oddfellows, and the 400 building, Friedman's Department Store. Just a little bit of history. Kemp's bought the properties, and in 2014, July 2014, came in looking for a wrecking permit to demolish the buildings. And staff made the determination at that point that they were potential historic resources and needed to go to the HPC for consideration of that demolition. Before that happened, Councilmember Yang nominated the properties, and later in July of 2014, the HPC approved that nomination and directed us to do a designation study. We extended the interim protection that they established in 2015 to January of 2016, so that's coming up January 16th. So we are out of interim protection by January 16th of this year. The designation studies were done by the CPED staff and went to SHPO and CPC and the HPC. Your staff report has that, has comment letters from SHPO, the Planning Commission, and correspondence from the public. You also have in there and it's an important piece of information, a condition report from Kemp's and a letter from Kemp's explaining their position on the condition of the building and their opinions on the designation. So talking about 404, that's just a picture of what it looks like, an Oddfellows Lodge, the front of it. Looking easterly down West Broadway at the boarded up storefront in the front. And then looking at the back of the building right there. We found, our staff made the recommendation that it was in the designation study that it was significant under criteria 1 and 3. 1 being that it's associated with significant events or periods that exemplify broad patterns of cultural, political, or economic or social history. Basically because it's an early example of an Oddfellows Lodge. It's one of the oldest. It was the second one in the city and the fourth in the state. It was also the first Rebecca Lodge and the second in the state. And the Rebecca Lodge was a type of lodge that the Oddfellows had that allowed women to be members. The Oddfellows had an interesting organizational structure that mirrored the U.S. Constitution, and other fraternal organizations copied that. And they were also pioneers in social welfare, women's rights, and we're at this site from 1897 to 1975. There are no other ones designated in the city as Oddfellows Lodges. Also significant under criteria number 3, associated with distinctive elements of city or neighborhood identity. And the distinctive elements of neighborhood identity is being a commercial building part of the West Broadway commercial corridor. And just some pictures of what the corridor looked like in 1914, the buildings being there. You can see rows of storefront buildings. A picture in 1949. This would be looking at, if you were standing on the off-ramp from I-94 looking west, you could see the rows of buildings. 1964 with Friedman's in the front, the Oddfellows here, and then the 410 at that time I believe was the Broadway Diner. Also a Chevy Corvair right there, which was a really cool car. Looking through a plan that the city did in 1964 called This is West Broadway, you can see the rows of front buildings. This was a building inventory that they did in there, and that's before the interstate came through. So West Broadway was, what's significant about that? West Broadway is part of the streetcar network. It was important, the most important commercial street in North Minneapolis. And a lot of the information in the designation study comes from something called the North Minneapolis Context Study. And I won't go through the whole history of West Broadway, but it just explains, and you can read that in the designation study, about the importance of this corridor. But after World War II, and this is probably obvious to everybody, there were broad social and economic trends that impacted West Broadway, and that would be, elimination of the streetcar, people tending to use autos more, moving to the suburbs, some of the racial tensions that happened, suburbanization, the construction of malls, and all of those had an impact on West Broadway. But West Broadway didn't see significant vacancies in their businesses, according to this study, until about 1960. But then between 1960 and 1973, over 100 businesses left the area. And at this point, you start seeing some of the planning that we did that started talking about tearing down chunks of West Broadway and building a mall on West Broadway. That's a plan from 64. From 1975, this would be the site right here, the Cloverleaf, now Kemp's Dairy. Interstate 94, this is my drawing on top of there, but just showing all of the red X's being all of the buildings that were taken down, moving westward just continually. I think you get the picture of how many buildings have come down, so that you're at the point now where you see West Broadway has many of the buildings set back and parking lots in front of them. I show that not to say that we should keep tearing buildings down or to say that everything is gone, but just to give you the context that there are a couple remnant parts of the West Broadway commercial corridor, and that would be this little area, although we're only considering 2 buildings, east of Kemp's, and then, of course, as we get further down on West Broadway on the south side. So we felt that this building had historic significance and it retained its historic integrity. That's a little bit different than structural condition or building condition, but historic condition of the building for all of the factors: location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. And I won't go through all of that, and I wouldn't want to lose you here. And we felt that the period of significance was from 1897 to 1964, the time it was built till about the time the West Broadway corridor started to have these dramatic changes. The City Planning Commission thought that this designation was in conformance with the comp plan. There's a letter in your packet. SHPO said that it was a good, State Historic Preservation Office said it was a good candidate for designation, and there's a letter. And the HPC also recommended that the City Council approve it as a landmark. At this point, I can go on and talk about 410, the next one if you want, or I can let you consider 404.
I think that would be appropriate to talk about the next building.
So this is a picture of 410, the diner building, the former White Castle building. I want to point out that the placards on there are not a violation notice, but that's just a notice of the Heritage Preservation Commission meeting. This is an addition that was done to the building in 1943, also using this enamel brick. Just some more pictures of its architectural detail and condition. And a picture of what it looked like in 1927. So we found that this building had historic significance under 3 criteria. The first criteria is the broad patterns of cultural, political, or social or economic history. And boy, I tell you, I think way more about White Castle than is probably healthy, but 410 is an early example of a White Castle. It's the oldest surviving one in Minneapolis. White Castle was one of the first fast food carryout changes, and they established the hamburger as an American food. The hamburger was considered really actually kind of an unsavory food, and White Castle, for better or worse, made people think that it was a safe, good food. And they promoted food safety and standardization. That was really the model for almost all of the other fast food restaurants in the country. We also thought it was significant for distinctive characteristics of architectural engineering type or style. And this style is called novelty or programmatic style. It's built to look like a castle to make you want to go buy a White Castle. And the interesting thing about this is that these White Castle used to build cinder block buildings, and then they started building white enamel brick buildings between 1924 and 1929. And then after that, they did the porcelain steel ones that you see, like the one down on Lyndale Avenue that can be detached and moved. And this is one of 3 surviving from that 1924 to 1929 period. One is in Kansas City and one is in Indianapolis. And then there's another one from 1930, which was actually a period when they started doing the porcelain rather than the enamel brick in Chicago. And I don't know how much stomach you have for all of this, but I've got pictures of all of the White Castle brick ones in Minneapolis that were torn down if you want to see them. But at this point, I won't show them all to you. However, as you can see, in 1944, when White Castle sold the building, it became the Silver Streak Diner. And as a condition of the sale, they required that the battlements on the top be removed. So you see that in other pictures that they're gone, and that the tower that was there be removed. And later the gooseneck lights were taken off and an addition was put on the side. So a lot of that early White Castle architectural novelty architecture has been changed, although there's still elements of it there. And then finally, we thought that it had significance, or we found that it had significance for being associated with distinctive elements of neighborhood identity. And that's the same thing that I just presented for the 404 building, the West Broadway corridor. So I won't go through that again. It's just the same thing. And so it's really two things. One is significant as a White Castle and architectural for White Castle, and also significant as being part of the West Broadway commercial corridor. And, it was after White Castle from 1944 to 77, a commercial storefront restaurant building. So looking at historic integrity, we felt as a White Castle, it's lost. It has its integrity of location. It's still there, but it's lost much of its design, setting, materials, workmanship, and feeling. So even though it's significant, a lot of that integrity as a White Castle is gone. But as a storefront commercial building on the West Broadway commercial corridor, it still still has a lot of its historical integrity remaining. And the period of significance for this building would be 1927 to 1964, once again from when it was built to when the corridor started to see dramatic changes. I almost coined a word there. The CPC thought the designation was in conformance with the comp plan, and the State Historic Preservation Office sent a letter saying that it was a good candidate for a designation. However, the Heritage Preservation Commission did not recommend to you that it be made a landmark. And based on their discussion, I think it was mainly because of the condition of the building. They felt that the historic integrity, and maybe even going a little bit beyond the criteria to be considered, the actual physical condition of the building was considered. And that was a vote of 5-4 to not recommend that it be made a landmark. At this point, I can answer any questions that you might have.
Are there any questions for staff? There are none. Thank you. So we did not notice this as a public hearing, so there will not be any public comment. So we can move to decision. My inclination would be to uphold the HPC recommendation, but I can see if anyone else wants to make a motion. That's fine. So I'll go ahead and move to, then that would be, let's see, to approve the landmark designation for item number 6, which is 404 West Broadway, and deny the landmark designation for 410 West Broadway, which is item number 7. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in approval, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That carries. Thank you. And we are adjourned. Thanks so much.
Did we do the appointments already?